Hello, everybody, and welcome to this book chat. I'm very excited about this. Those of you who know Jerry, my colleague, know that he is a very thoughtful person, very clever and creative in his work, and also just has an amazing way of communicating his ideas. You can already see some of his humor coming out in the chat. The way we're going to run this event this afternoon is Jerry's going to take about 15 minutes to explain what's in his book. He has a PowerPoint deck to go there. He and I will have a conversation, some questions that I'd like to ask. Having read the book, I have an advanced copy sitting right here, and I've gone through it. Lots of good stuff to think about, lots of good stuff to chew on. And then we'll open it up to questions from you folks. We'll take the last 20 minutes. We're going to use the software package Poll Everywhere. If you've taken a class with me, you're familiar with it. I'm going to drop a hyperlink into the chat right now. And that allows you to add a question or up and down vote a question. And that way we'll get the best questions, the ones that are most interesting to the most people in our Zoom space today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jerry. Jerry will show some slides, give us a talk, and then we'll get a discussion started. So Jerry, take it away.
Yeah, thanks very much, Andy. Really appreciate this. So this is a very quick overview of a pretty short book. I can promise you this, most of my books ruin a whole day. This one will only ruin an afternoon if you manage to download it. It's available free for download in the next week or so at Cambridge University Press, and it's Taming Corporate Power in the 21st Century. To give a little bit of background on why we need this book, my last book was called The Vanishing American Corporation, which is a kind of non-obvious title. And the puzzle behind that book is, why is it that public corporations in the US are vanishing? That sounds very counterintuitive, but if you look at the numbers, the number of corporations listed on US stock markets has dropped by over half since 1997. So weirdly, corporations are a kind of endangered species in the US, at least public corporations. And your immediate thought might be that's because big companies just buy up their competitors and keep getting bigger and bigger. But that's really not exactly the case. If you look back to when I was in business school long ago, these were the pillars of American corporate capitalism. These were the 30 members of the Dow Jones Index. Now, anybody under 40 doesn't recognize most of these names. They don't know what Westinghouse or Woolworth or American Can or Bethlehem Steel are. They didn't buy their competitors and become bigger. They mostly faded into irrelevance or sort of stumbling off the field like GE and a few others. You look to today, and the ones in red are the only ones left listed in the Dow Jones Index. And not all of them are going to last for all that much longer either. We're in this weird situation where the pillars of American corporate capitalism seem to be disappearing. And that seemed surprising and counterintuitive. If you're a big fan of Austrian economists, you might say, yay, it's creative destruction. The old big guys are going away and new startups are taking their place. But that's not really the case either. If you look at the number of initial public offerings, that has also pretty much collapsed since the 1990s. It was a big deal during the Clinton administration, but it's never really managed to return to the numbers that we had then. We are still at a very low rate, barely enough to replenish the number of corporations that keep disappearing. And if you want to skip that book and get to the punchline, my explanation for why corporations are disappearing is that information and communication technologies have drastically lowered the transaction costs for accessing the core factor markets. It's cheaper to gain access to financing through financial markets. You can outsource production to suppliers the way that Nike has through Nikeification. Amazon has become a sort of universal distribution channel, at least for physical goods. Uberization has created online spot markets for labor. So we found ourselves in this situation where, because of information and communication technologies, the components to start an enterprise look like a pile of Legos waiting to be assembled. So if you have a pile of Legos, you can create a business like the Instant Pot. One of my favorite businesses, probably the greatest advance in human civilization since the start of the 21st century, I would say. If you don't have one yet, get one immediately. It'll change your life. Lovely product. And it was started by a gentleman in Ottawa that he sort of self-designed it, used $350,000 of his own money, contracted out manufacturing to a vendor in China, distribution to Amazon, And for $350,000, started a business. It's now selling 300,000 units a day during Prime Day, which is a pretty amazing business with almost no assets or employees. That's the world that we're living in now. It doesn't just apply to manufacturing, it also applies to service. TikTok, the video social media format, announced in December that they are opening a virtual restaurant where foods that go viral on TikTok, you will be able to order them on TikTok. They'll be conveyed to a ghost kitchen and then delivered to your porch by Grubhub. Well, this is weird. Is TikTok now a restaurant? What kind of an enterprise is this thing? That's the kind of the world that we're living in now. The question that I had for this book is, what does all of this mean for corporate power? This shift to intermediated forms of transactions where everything takes place through online communications. What does it mean for the sources of corporate power? The first thing that I discovered after my book agent pointed this out to me is that everyone in the world has written a book about antitrust in the last few years. The Curse of Bigness, Goliath Monopolized. You know, something is up when Amy Klobuchar and Josh Hawley both publish books on antitrust in the same week. So clearly this is a crowded field. And I've read all of these books and I can tell you what they say in 2 sentences so that you can just skip it, save your money, and buy my book instead. So Benjamin Applebaum at the New York Times had a lovely column that summarized the conventional wisdom about monopolies. He said corporate concentrations of corporate power are now the norm in the United States. 2018 study found that concentration has increased in 3/4 of domestic industries in recent decades, giving companies greater power to raise prices, squeeze suppliers, and suppress wages, and to exert outsized influence on regulators and politicians. That sentence is the entire antitrust narrative in one sentence, and every book retails this same narrative, that concentrated companies can crush labor, squeeze their suppliers, overcharge customers, and use their ill-gotten gains to dominate politics. That's pretty much all of those books in one. You're welcome. I've now saved you several weeks worth of reading. The thing is, if this is a complicated diagnosis. If you think about what the United States has done to tame corporate power over the course of the 20th century, when sort of major corporations like that Dow Jones list dominated, it's tended to be by trying to regulate their constituent markets. So during the Progressive era, the Sherman Act somewhat regulated product markets. The Clayton Act extended that to supplier markets. And so that was sort of suppliers and distribution. In the New Deal era, the 33 and 34 Acts regulated capital markets, separated investment banking from commercial banking. The labor markets were regulated with the 1935 Wagner Act and the Fair Labor Standard Act of 1938. So in a sense, the way that we got corporations to behave was regulating the constituent markets that they drew on and participated in. Well, we're now in this very interesting situation. 10 years ago, Mark Andreessen, the venture capitalist and the founder of Netscape, published an article in the Wall Street Journal called Why Software is Eating the World. And he projected that software over the coming decade would take over more and more of the essence of what was going on in businesses. And I'm here to tell you that he is right. This really has happened over the subsequent decade. Silicon Valley and tech firms have largely changed the operations of the core factor markets. One of the results of this is that it's also dining on our essential understanding of how the economy is organized. The core categories that we use to understand the way the economy works increasingly just don't apply the way that they did for most of the 20th century. So I'm a giant Detroit fan, as you will hear, as you cannot escape me mentioning on a regular basis. There's a lovely painting at the Detroit Institute of Arts by Fernand Léger called Girl with Flower, which is here on the right. And you can see it's got this very complicated outline of a woman's face. She's got a necklace and a shawl and this collar and a complicated looking flower, very complex outlines. And then you've got these very simple color blocks in yellow and orange, green, blue, red, yellow again, these very simple blocks that don't color in the lines. They don't fit with the outlines. To me, this is a metaphor for what has happened with our understanding of the economy. We've got these very simple categories that we're trying to apply to a very complicated economy today. So what is a firm? What is an employee? What is an industry? What do we mean by big? What is nationality? These things that we take to be very basic seem to be evaporating in some sense. And that's what I spend a chunk of the book trying to unpack is the breakdown of the categories that we normally use to diagnose power and the organization of the economy. So what do we mean by a firm? You'd think that economists would give us a nice, clear definition that would be easy to measure, and they don't. They are very denotative and not very connotative. And when they sit down to say, here's the three things that distinguish a firm from a family or a church or something else, they say something like this: an economic organization in which private owners of capital goods hire and direct labor to produce goods and services for sale on markets to make a profit. Sounds pretty good. Well, what about the Instant Pot? The gentleman that started this business doesn't own the factory, doesn't own the capital goods, doesn't have any employees. He doesn't hire and direct labor to produce goods and services. Is this thing a firm or is it something else? What about the TikTok restaurant? Does that thing count as a firm? All right, let's move past that. Maybe that's not the thing to be thinking about. What counts as an employee? One of the most horrifying things I've read in the last several years is an article called Revolt of the Delivery Drivers in The Verge, highly recommended to you. And it's describing the 65,000 bicycle delivery people that operate in New York City. And it's astounding. You'd think this is the very sort of low end of the labor market. And yet, if you want to be a delivery rider in New York City, you need to buy a $2,000 electric bike because the expectations of customers for quick delivery are so high that you won't even get any deliveries to make if you're not on an electric bike. And it turns out that thieves love $2,000 electric bikes. It's an incredibly brutal labor market, but they're not employees. What counts as an industry? Here's a list of companies that have gone public in the US in the not too distant past: Airbnb, Coursera, Olo, Palantir, and so on. They're in a lot of different industries seemingly, but according to their IPO prospectus, all of them are in 7372 prepackaged software. So they're not in the hotel or the restaurant or the education industry. They're in prepackaged software. Well, that's not really getting at what we mean by industry anymore. What are America's biggest corporations? We think that big sounds very obvious. Matt Stoller's blog is called Big, as if we all know what a big corporation is. Well, what is America's biggest corporation today? If you're counting by revenues, the answer is Walmart. They are clearly the biggest. Then Amazon, and a bunch of companies you've never heard of, like McKesson and AmerisourceBergen, these anonymous middlemen that have a lot of revenues, but sort of are in a peculiar business like drug distribution. What about by number of employees? Well, you get Walmart and Amazon again, but a very different set of other businesses: UPS, Home Depot, Kroger, Target, and so on. What about market cap? Yet a different set of businesses: Apple, Microsoft, Tesla, Facebook. What do we mean by big? We think we know the answer to that question. It's something where they all would have been big on the same metric in 1980, but that's no longer the case. The only companies that are on all three of these lists are Amazon and Walmart. So something as basic as big seems fairly befuddling to us. The case of Zoom, we all know Zoom very intimately. Single-handedly enabled work from home for white-collar workers, had 500 million downloads in 2020, 300 million daily users. I haven't checked in a while, but they had a market cap in the $80 billion range. Interestingly, they had only 4,422 employees in the world. That is less than 1% of the number of employees at Home Depot. And they rent server space from Amazon and Oracle. So is Zoom a giant corporation or a minuscule corporation? The category of size doesn't really work as a metaphor the way that we would like it to. The last thing I'd point to is nationality. So Coinbase is a cryptocurrency exchange, if that's a meaningful phrase to you. Then their IPO prospectus if you ask what industry is it in, is it securities brokerage, banking, finance? No, it's 7389 business services, not elsewhere classified, which also puts it in the same category as Robinhood and Lyft, strangely enough. Where does Coinbase live? So I have this cryptic looking thing, address not applicable. You go down to the footnote and it says in May 2020, we became a remote first company. Accordingly, we do not maintain a headquarters. So Coinbase does not have physical locations. They've got people, but they don't really have a place. So how do you think about regulating an entity like this? I am not going to go through this slide. I will tell you that there's a whole lot of ideas out there for regulating big sort of tech corporations, but the tech corporation, it's kind of scattershot. It's not really rooted in a theory about the sources of corporate power. I guess I'd leave with the question, how do we use the tools that we now have to try to create equitable enterprises that are more democratic, humane, and responsive to their communities, and be less reliant on these sort of new entities that are emerging? And that's where I want to end.
Okay, thank you. Again, I want to remind you, if you want to ask a question, poll everywhere is open. Some questions are popping up. You can up and down vote them. But to get the conversation going, Jerry, when I read this, one thing that came through for me, and I think it's applicable for our audience, is what does this mean for what we're teaching students in the Ross School of Business? And I sort of grabbed a couple of main themes in your book. One is the idea of corporate power, but you seem to be focusing specifically on IT, on social media. So it's not just corporate power writ large, but that kind of corporate power, which brings in other dimensions. And then the other, you definitely take a shot, it's shareholder capitalism. You know, the rules of the game under shareholder capitalism favor profit, whatever its source and whatever its consequence for society, which is a fairly clear statement. So if we could tease those two out, I want to begin. You do point out that Robert Bork gave us a definition or an idea of what the Sherman Antitrust Act was all about, and you say it's wrong. Can you explain that so the students understand?
The American antitrust tradition from the progressive era toward the sort of the passage of the Sherman Act up until right about 1980, the idea was that antitrust was about taming corporate power, not just keeping prices low for customers, but making sure that the forms of competition were fair, limiting the political power of corporations, limiting their ability to mistreat labor. It was really meant as a political movement to try to rein in these giant corporations that were only then being constructed. Remember, in 1890, when the Sherman Act passed, there were fewer than 10 manufacturers traded on stock markets. We were a regional agricultural economy. The corporate economy was just being born. This was meant to tame these things, to try to make it so that the rules of the game aligned what's good for business with what's good for society by limiting the kinds of things that corporations could do, by making them sort of good actors or limiting the unfortunate effects of their power. That went back and forth in various ways over the course of the 20th century. And what a lot of the current enthusiasm around anti-monopoly and reviving antitrust is saying, we made a wrong turn when Robert Bork managed to, not Robert Bork alone, but the courts and the Reagan administration change the orientation of antitrust towards keeping prices low for customers. So what had been this sort of rich tradition, according to the critics, got reduced to how do we keep prices low for customers? And so it's a violation if a merger or an action is going to raise prices for customers. Otherwise, no harm, no foul. This is at least the narrative around it. I have some quibbles with that, but that is the narrative around Bork. I mean, your first question was, what should we be doing differently in business schools? If you look at a business like Instant Pot or the TikTok restaurant, it does not look a lot like the kinds of things that we teach in business schools. These companies don't need to go public on a stock market. So maybe you don't need to take that finance class or that financial accounting course. They don't own any of the factories that they operate, so you might be able to skip operations. They don't have any employees, so you might not really need your management course. And they don't do advertising. They go for, they might use influencers, or they might just aim to get a very high rating on Amazon. And if that's sufficient to get you the customers you need, then much of the 4Ps sort of falls by the wayside. You don't really need to worry so much about marketing. Well, this is complicated. If the core things that we teach in a business school don't have quite the same direct application, then that's complicated for us. I mean, I think our curriculum, General Motors and Harvard Business School were born the same year, 1908. And I think there's a real intertwining there of the big corporation with lots of employees and big buildings and factories, and the sort of the Harvard Business School version of what a curriculum looks like. And I think now we really need to be thinking to the future about designing something that doesn't look like, the General Motors factory of 50 years ago.
So that sounds to me like the barriers of entry are very low, that someone can start a company like this company with very little assets and not many costs in terms of marketing and things like that. Yet you have an entire section with a very provocative title called The Hollow Promise of Entrepreneurship for All. Are you saying that entrepreneurship is easier or harder, or there's some kind of bait and switch going on? Help us understand that.
It's a really complicated question, but I'm going to make it simple. So a fun experiment you can do on your own right now is go to Amazon and look up Power Brick for a Microsoft Surface 6, which is awesome. If you do this, you will discover that there are over 100 competing products on Amazon selling seemingly the identical item, and they range in price from $14 to $105. How is it conceivable that there's $14 and $105 seemingly a power brick, a fairly sort of commoditized thing? Look up hubcaps for a 1995 Ford Fusion. You will see dozens of vendors out there. There are so many small businesses out there. In some sense, if what you want to do is launch a product on Amazon, find a vendor on Alibaba to manufacture it, anyone can do it. If you want to write an app and get it on the App Store, you can do that. So in some sense, it's never been easier to start a business. The paradox is that the rate of new business startups, by some measures, has been in decline since the Carter administration. Up until 3 years ago, our numbers were about half what they were when you and I were in high school during the late 70s, which sounds insane. Now, interestingly, during COVID, that's greatly shot up. So last year, there were 50% more new business applications than in 2019. So COVID has flushed a lot of side hustles out there into the entrepreneurial world. But when I talk about the hollow promise of entrepreneurship, what makes me most anxious is that the rhetoric of entrepreneurship, what Bob Eberhart writes about, the rhetoric of entrepreneurship, the idea that everyone can be a yeoman farmer, as Thomas Jefferson wrote about, controlling their own destiny, that rhetoric makes it easier to have the Ubers and DoorDashes and Fivers of the world say, sure, you are driving a cab, but you are your own boss. You're the CEO of the brand called you. And I worry that the entrepreneurial rhetoric serves as this kind of, palliative care, like it's like a vehicle to allow a fairly brutal form of economic competition, hyper-competitive labor markets, but under the guise of this being, be your own boss, be your own CEO. Calling it entrepreneurship ennobles something that others might call, being a member of the lumpen proletariat.
You present the charts of the changes in the Dow list of companies and how it changes over years. I've seen people play that up to say, see, capitalism works, Schumpeterian creative destruction. It's constantly turning over, and this is a good thing, but you're saying no. Can you explain?
The other side of the equation is we're not seeing nearly the startups that we think we should. So we are not seeing we might be seeing Zynga, which makes Farmville, but we are not seeing the replacements for a Westinghouse or a Bethlehem Steel. And so we are seeing the destruction, but the creation part still seems pretty complicated. Yeah.
Interesting. Now, again, on the entrepreneurship thing, I was reading your section about this and how, you know, we're in a world now where we're writing contracts to be an Uber driver or a Lyft driver. Isn't this transaction cost economics dream? Isn't this what economists see as the purpose of the corporation playing out in real time for us?
Well, I would never say anything rude about economists. Certainly that would violate my religion and my professional code. Let's put a more charitable spin on that transaction costs provides a pretty useful way to think about how we found ourselves in this situation. So when Ronald Coase described why we have firms, why do we have corporations in the first place, it's because using markets can be costly. When it costs a lot of money to shop for employees, to shop for suppliers, to shop for distribution channels, sometimes it's cheaper to just bring them under one roof and call it a corporation. To be a vertically integrated company, to have a giant factory that makes its own steel and glass, the way that Ford's Rouge plant did. Under some circumstances, that's going to be the cheapest overall. And what we've seen because of information and communication technologies, which I sort of went over pretty quickly, is that they are driving down the transaction costs of using markets. It gets cheaper and cheaper to use markets rather than vertically integrate. So there was a time when you didn't have an alternative to doing your own payroll. Now any business is going to go to ADP to do that. There were times when if you wanted to have computer power, you had to build a set of servers in your basement, but now anybody can use Amazon Web Services. And so it's just become cheaper to use the markets for inputs and for distribution channels than it used to. So I think transaction costs gives us a tool to think about how we ended up here. And I don't want to blame them for our not too distant future where everybody's going to be bidding against each other for shifts and the low bidder will win. And your wages will vary from day to day and maybe hour to hour according to market conditions. That might be a market utopia, but if you're trying to get a mortgage, that's probably not going to be a great situation to be in.
Okay. We have about 8 minutes before we turn it over to the students and ask questions. I see them starting to pop up on poll everywhere, so please get your questions in or up, down, vote them. But let's turn our sights onto the other element of your book, which you are very clear about, and that's shareholder capitalism. And again, I love some of your quotes. They're very provocative and they pack a punch. And this one jumped out at me. Let's be very clear. Profit-oriented corporations are responsible for a lot of mischief. Indeed, nearly every pathology in American society today was created or exacerbated by corporations. Later, you say the biggest problem is not monopoly, it's shareholder capitalism. Yet that is implanted within our education system. How do we properly bring our students or train our students to go out into a world where shareholder capitalism is the dominant mode, and yet it's causing these problems?
I think about this a lot, and in my own teaching, I've thought about two prongs to it. So Rosa Luxemburg published a book in 1900 called Reform or Revolution. My feeling is, why not both? So in the reform format, you'd say, how do we take the existing organizations that we have and reorient them in a path that might better serve humanity? So we've got an awful lot of oil and gas companies, and it probably doesn't make sense to send everyone a pink slip and say, go home. They're good at a lot of different things that could be repurposed in a direction that might be more sustainable. So your co-author, Jennifer Howard Grenville, says, look, who knows more about operating offshore on giant platforms than oil exploration companies? Well, those skills could also be used for offshore wind farms or using the waves for energy. And so a lot of what we're good at can be repurposed. That's the reform agenda. The revolution agenda would be, how do we create entirely new forms of enterprise? I think you're the one that said the tradition of all the dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living.
I didn't say that, but it sounds good.
Sounds like you. It feels like we are very weighted with traditions about how we teach things. But, think about Albert Kahn, who designed so many buildings at the University of Michigan and the Ford Model T factory and the Rouge plant. He had a set of new raw materials to create architecture. Reinforced concrete suddenly became tractable and affordable. Plate glass, machine rolled plate glass, structural steel. In 1905, we had this new deck of cards, this new set of materials for building structures. And every downtown and every factory from the first half of the 20th century looks radically different because we had these new tools for building something new. I think it would be a shame if we took Albert Kahn and trained him how to make an 1850s New England textile mill, because that's the way we've always done it. You'd want to say, hey, we've got some new problems to solve. We've got some new materials. Let's face forward and create new kinds of enterprise, new kinds of structures that aren't bound by sort of the rules of the past. So this is what the Impact Studio course at Ross is all about, is we've got new materials. Let's create new ways of thinking about it. You could be a perpetual purpose trust or a public benefit corporation or an L3C. You could have you could have sort of employee democracy all the way down. There's a lot of new ways to organize that don't necessarily look like Eastman Kodak in 1970.
Last question, and then I'm going to turn it over to the students. But I just finished on my class re-examining capitalism, and the students had to write a final paper. Is capitalism in need of amending? And if so, what would you do? A little bit of a leading question. And I read a lot of papers. I've been reading a lot of papers over the last few days talking about reinvigorating the role of government in the market, perhaps some kind of industrial policy. A lot of attention to the work of Mariana Mazzucato and her ideas about connecting, the collaboration between business and government, the need for stronger unions or stronger labor power, changing the role of the corporation, moving away from short-term thinking, changing CEO pay structures, all kinds of ideas. To use your metaphor that with Albert Kahn of a deck of materials, if we were to rearrange the deck of materials that we teach students on how business operates for a more functional economy, where would you start?
The perfect academic dodge is this is a place for more research. And I got to tell you, the next book that I'm looking at has the working title Suicide Pact, how shareholder capitalism is destroying our species, and probably come up with something catchier. But this is a real dilemma. I am an elderly man. I'm 60 years old. I've got one foot in the grave. And my ability to retire depends very heavily on the value of the stock market. I'm not saying that I hang my head when Netflix loses 42% of its value in a week, but a quarter of the S&P 500 is five big tech companies. And so on the one hand, some of those big tech companies really need to be reined in. I think there's a lot of things that we might want to think about doing with some of these big tech companies. And yet, as a potential retiree, my ability to live opulently depends a lot on the valuation of these things. That's kind of the situation that we found ourselves in, is most of American households are invested in the stock market. It's the way that, why can't Facebook behave itself when Mark Zuckerberg controls 60% of the voting rights? They could do the right thing. One guy controls all of the power at that company. But if the stock price goes down, the employees grumble and leave. And so we've set ourselves up with this situation where so much of our well-being is tied to shareholder value that it's very difficult to come up with a pathway that would allow us to think differently about that. It would be personally costly for me to implement the policies that I think would make us much better off. I'm happy to do that, but it is a thing. We've really created a set of gears that make it very difficult to go into reverse. We've created a system where it's very difficult to look square in the face and say, this is going to hurt. Tearing off this Band-Aid is not going to be pleasant, but it is the essential path forward. And I think that's the thing that we need to be thinking about and debating. It's not the case that if only every company would adopt ESG, they'd all be good citizens and we'd all be rich because you can do well by doing good. I don't think that's the case. And I think that the path to a sustainable, humane future is going to have winners and losers. I think it's going to involve some pretty difficult decisions, and we have to do it. Yeah. So I wish I had the everybody wins kumbaya thing, but I just don't think that's the case. I mean, doing what's right is going to crash the stock market.
I mean, I think that's a great way to transition, because we in the business school do teach the win-win. We do teach you can have your cake and eat it too. You can increase profits and address climate change. And, we are a consumerist society. If we reduce consumption, are people going to lose their jobs? We're not going to buy as much stuff. That's going to affect somebody. How are we going to make those difficult decisions? Because right now our head is in the sand on these kinds of things. Okay, now let's turn to the questions. And one aspect of Poll Everywhere is that if your question gets too long, it ends with ... So I'm going to ask whoever asked the first question, the one that got upvoted the most, and it just turned as I was looking at it, Jerry. Someone wrote a question: hundreds of thousands of companies have issued statements in support of diversity and racial justice. Whoever asked that question, could you unmute yourself and ask the whole question?
I think that's Janet Weiss.
Janet, are you there? She did put a question in the chat, so I'll ask it. Hundreds of thousands of companies have issued statements in support of diversity and racial justice 2020 and 2021, or Ukraine 2022. How, if at all, do these changes in corporate structure affect how we should understand the rhetoric of these statements?
Thank you, Andy. Sorry, I had trouble unmuting.
No problem. Do you want to elaborate?
No, I just want to ask, should we take this more seriously because it's coming from companies that have disaggregated their structure, or should we take it even less seriously than we would have when companies had sort of more at stake and more on the table?
It's a really fascinating time when it comes to corporations taking political stances of this sort. 10 years ago, you would not have seen hundreds of corporations changing their website to say Black Lives Matter and doing their best to be sincere. That feels like a very different world that we're living in. My sense is that a lot of that is driven by the demands of employees who want to be recognized and who want to be heard. I think in many, many cases, demonstrably, those statements are made because if you want to recruit people under the age of 30, you better be attentive to the values that they bring to bear. And I think that's largely been the case. Your question about the disaggregation of corporations is a really good one, because for many companies, the only thing that they have is their brand and a handful of employees and the capacity to rent assets and other aspects of sort of corporate operations. And so what they've really got is a name and a set of values associated with it. Does that influence their sincerity? It's interesting. They don't really live in any particular place. If you are not literally physically rooted, say, in the state of Florida, what say do you have on the politics going on in the state of Florida? If you're Coinbase and you are not tied to any particular place, Martin Wolf revived the phrase rootless cosmopolitans to refer to corporations that really don't have a place, that they're not headquartered or grounded in any one particular place. What do their interests look like in that setting? I think the answer is that it really depends on what interests can they say that will allow them to retain their employees and keep them on side, because that's the one thing that's hardest for them to replace. I don't know if that's answering the question, but that's the way I've been thinking about it.
It was just a survey that a majority of CEOs admit a lot of their statements on sustainability are greenwashing, which is a little discouraging. The next question, again, I'm going to ask someone to unmute. It begins, as future B school grads, how do we approach the inequities present in today's version of capitalism? But it does go to ... Do you want to finish that question for us?
Hey, Andy, it's Tyrese.
Hi,
Thank
Therese.
you for
Welcome.
putting this on. Yeah, I had the pleasure of having class with both of you. So thank you for this. But my question is, as future B school grads, how do we approach the equities present in today's version of capitalism? What are some high-level steps that we can take to transform how the economy works?
Yeah, I love that question. Thank you, Tyrese. I think it's part of the issue is that we have a set of narratives about the way the economy works that are wrong, that we've got sort of a story about the way the economy works that don't necessarily map onto the actual operations of it. My first recommendation would be we need a better map. We need a better set of understandings of the way this whole thing works if we want to be able to point it in the right direction. And this is my beef with the anti-monopoly movement is, you know, their heart is in the right place, but their brain is not. They want to get corporations to behave themselves and to behave more equitably, but they have a diagnosis that's rooted in a sort of 1950s era understanding of the way the American economy works. And I think we need to have a better map essentially first. So what, as I put it in the book, that what they're doing is like trying to fix the carburetor on a Tesla. If you're not a car person, Tesla is electric, and a carburetor is the thing that preceded electronic fuel injection. Is that right, Andy?
It's aspirated, but it doesn't matter.
Okay, but yeah, it's sort of they're going for a cure that doesn't really work in the world we're in now. So coming up with a good map is a start, but I think having the right set of values in place goes a really long way. One of my favorite readings that I revisit every 6 months or so is a speech that Teddy Roosevelt made in 1910 to a set of Union Army veterans in Osawatomie, Kansas. And it was called the New Nationalism Speech. And he was saying, look, here's a problem. Corporations are too big and too powerful. They use their profits to buy politicians and corrupt the democratic process. And they're enriching a bunch of bankers and people that are remote from the business. Like, that sounds very familiar. It sounds like a very familiar diagnosis. And he said, we need to come up with a set of rules so that the pursuit of what's best for business redounds to the benefit of the community. That if you do what's good for yourself, if you do what's good for your business, that the community benefits from this. If you take actions that are harmful to the community, you shouldn't get rewarded for that. And so the ultimate goal really is to come up with a set of rules so that competing, doing business makes the world better off. And what feels like a sign that we've taken a wrong turn is the likes of Purdue Pharma making tons of money by essentially bribing high prescribing physicians to prescribe OxyContin for off-label uses in bulk, thus fomenting an opioid epidemic that has literally reduced the lifespan of Americans, which is an astounding thing. Or Juul, which created a vehicle to try to help grown-ups quit smoking, and in the hands of profit-maximizing venture capitalists, they start using it to sell candy-flavored vape pods to tweens on the internet, or Facebook, or name your poison here. Something's gone wrong when the way to make a quick buck, the way to make money, ends up being intrinsically harmful to the larger community. That shouldn't be the case. And so we need a good map to inform the creation of rules that will orient business in a way where doing business serves all of us rather than just allowing a few to cash in, then retire to New Zealand.
And does that speak to the need for a stronger government?
I'd say it speaks to the need for a better informed government. I think what we need is, it's not sort of more regulation or less regulation so much as just better regulation, better informed regulation. And I do think that we need to make government roles better remunerated. What worries me a lot these days is that a lot of people graduate from law school, go to work at a federal agency, the SEC or other agencies for 2 years to enforce good rules. And that gives you the insider cachet and knowledge to then cash in and spend the rest of your career undermining those rules by working in big law. So we don't want government service to be a brief stop off to give you the credential or the insights you need to then do what people do. It would be nice if long-term government employment were remunerative and respected enough that the best and brightest said, this is where I want to plant myself. That had been true for a very long time. That's still true in places like Singapore. We make it very difficult in the US by demonizing government and making it unremunerative and an unpleasant place to work. We don't get the kind of regulation we'd like to see.
The next question, and again, this one, we have the whole question, but I'm still going to ask the person who asked it to maybe elaborate or expand if they want. It's on stable state economy and degrowth. Who asked that question? Please unmute yourself and ask it.
Hi, Jerry. Hi, Andy. This is Doug. Thank you both for your time today. This is really interesting. My question is about, it seems a fairly pessimistic take that the economy will collapse if this changes. And I'm wondering if there's any hope.
Stock market. Sorry, I said stock market.
Okay, stock market.
Don't
Okay,
conflate those two.
That is very different, and especially as the stakeholder capitalism, we talk about evolving away from that. But given where we're at and that the economy may need to shrink if the stock market collapses, is there a hope for a degrowth movement or a stable state? Is that possible to shift away from a perpetual growth win-win economy?
Yeah, well, thanks, Doug. Thank you for your generation being quite willing to never own a home and wanting to rent everything and not own anything. It certainly makes it much more plausible for us if you're willing to forego home ownership and filling it with IKEA furniture. It makes it more plausible. A nation of vagabonds certainly could be a thing. It is. I think it's going to be really hard to hold up to people. Okay. I think that building community and building self-sufficiency might turn out to be the pathway that people find reasonable and generative and useful. It's, we're living in a moment where we're creating new products that are both dumb and lethal, like forms of cryptocurrency that are, using more energy than the government of the people of Finland, which kind of seems insane to me. So we're sort of heading in both the right and the wrong direction at the same time. But the tools are really there for us to create a much more just economy that I think is relatively locally self-sufficient and that gives people more of what they actually want. I, for one, would be happy to give up many of my worldly goods if 15 hours a week was what I had to work. So I think it's possible that as sort of notions of the experience economy in many ways trump the physical production and shipping of goods, that it's imaginable that we could have a world where sort of people trade in experience that is not as environmentally disastrous as fast fashion or frequent shifts of cars. So that would be the optimistic take, is that we could imagine sort of being the architects of a new set of institutions that we find more fulfilling, more rewarding, that give us more of our time and more of the things that we would really value if we had access to them, than the world of sort of relentless consumption. But that's more like restating the question with a bit of optimism attached.
Mm-hmm. The next question, I'll ask it, but if the person wants to elaborate, how much should corporations get involved in social impact issues that come and go? What leverage do they have? And whoever asked that, do you want to elaborate a little more?
Hi, it's Glenn. I was the one who asked that question. I sort of like to believe that companies do have the power to influence on important social issues. They maybe aren't always wise in the decisions that they make to speak up on, and maybe their positions aren't always helpful.
This is such a great moment for exactly that question. Like, this is the week that Governor DeSantis and the Florida state legislature takes on the evil, woke, left-wing Disney Corporation. We used to be worried that they were training our children in inflexible gender roles and unrealistic perceptions of what life is like as a grown-up. Now they're worried that they're too woke and the state of Florida wants to strip them of their tax benefits. It is such a fascinating time when politicians from this one particular political party are scoring points by going up against woke corporations like Walmart and Disney and JP Morgan. I feel like I've wandered into a sort of hall of mirrors where the political positions are in such a scramble that it's really difficult. It's like you see the compass and the pointer is spinning around, and it's really hard to figure out which way is north at this moment. I think that there is some reason to think that incumbent corporations can point in the right direction. They're very good at orienting towards creating shareholder value and creating profits, and on some occasions, those things point them in a direction that favors equity and democracy and good employment practices. Not always, but it does happen in some particular cases. And they are very responsive to their installed base of employees. And all of the indicators that I've seen, all of the Pew Research data and other sources suggest that the average human in the United States under the age of 35 is a Bernie voter on some of the most basic aspects around racism, climate change, acceptance that love is love, and marriage equality. The generation under 35, the people that these companies are trying to hire and want to have as future consumers, might nudge them in a direction that looks, more like one that you might find acceptable. Then on the other hand, there's also a revanchist bloc that wants to use political powers to strip them of benefits and sort of change their orientation. And we're like living through this right now, like this upcoming election. We're seeing corporations facing pressures in all directions. And if I didn't have to live through it, if it were just a fun prestige television miniseries on Netflix, that would be great. Living through it means that we have some responsibility to think these things through and participate in these issues. So I'm hoping that, we in academia and in the business school can have some positive role in pointing us in a more positive direction. I love what the Herb Institute is doing with the corporate political
Transparency, I think.
Thank you.
Responsibility. CPR.
Corporate Political Responsibility Task Force. It has a very long name, but they're thinking through these issues. What does it mean to be politically responsible? What does it mean for corporations to be responsible citizens in trying to build a democratic, humane, sustainable society? So, this is an interesting place to be right now, because many more things are up for grabs than we would have guessed even 5 years ago. And so I am, in spite of everything, I am an optimist at heart. And I think that we actually have some levers that we can pull, some tools we can use to point this ship in the right direction. So I think and hope that we're in the right place for that.
Well, I think that brings us to the top of the hour. I think that brings us to the end. So thank you, Jerry. I recommend this book to everyone. It's part of a series from Cambridge University Press called Elements in Reinventing Capitalism. And so that gives me some hope that the conversation's been engaged, that we need to rethink the system in which all of you are going to go practice your craft, but also all of us live under. An element you bring out in the book that I think is very important is that capitalism is one way to structure the economy. But I had Belle Sawhill in my class from Brookings, and she said, but it's not a very good way to structure a society. And that tension and that dynamic is really important. So again, thank you very much, Jerry. Let's give him our Zoom version of applause. And please go out and get the book. And thank you very much.
Thank you, friends. Let me just point out, free download at Cambridge University Press in the next couple of weeks. So you should be able to get the whole thing free. They promised it'd be due tomorrow, and then they changed their minds, but very shortly should be able to download it free. I don't need the money, so get your free version and tell your friends.
Our next event in this series will be Jerry interviewing Andy about Andy's book, Management as Calling, on May 11th at 5:30 p.m. Eastern. You can register for that on the Business+Impact website.
It's a mutual admiration society here. Thanks,
So long,
friends.
everybody. Thank you.